Cordelia Botkin was born on February 7, 1854, in Birdsboro, Pennsylvania, United States. Born into a traditional family in the region, Cordelia grew up in an environment where social expectations were strict and the role of women in society was clearly defined. Mid-19th century Pennsylvania was undergoing a period of industrial transformation, but small towns like Birdsboro still preserved conservative values and a rigid social structure. At first glance, nothing about Cordelia Botkin's youth indicated that her name would transcend time and be linked to one of the most shocking crimes of the late 19th century. In a society that valued reputation, modesty, and female obedience, Cordelia learned early on to conform to the imposed rules, even while internally grappling with silent frustrations. What no one could have predicted was that years later, unresolved emotions, rejection, and resentment would transform that ordinary woman into the protagonist of a case that would shake the United States and go down in history. The late 19th century was a period of intense transformation in the United States, marked by the advancement of industrialization, reconstruction after the Civil War, and profound changes in social relations. Despite this scenario of progress, women remained trapped in rigid roles, with few opportunities for autonomy, financial independence, or personal choice. Deviating from imposed norms meant facing judgment, isolation, and social ruin. It was within this context that Cordelia Botkin built her adult life. Marriage, reputation, and public image occupied a central place in her existence, while emotional conflicts remained hidden. In the eyes of society, she was just another woman trying to fit the expectations of her time. However, behind this facade, impulsive decisions and troubled relationships began to trace a dangerous path. The case that would make Cordelia Botkin famous would forever be marked in American criminal history as the chocolate box case, a crime that shocked public opinion not only because of the death it caused, but also because of the method used, a seemingly harmless gift sent through the mail that concealed a lethal intent. The idea that a gesture associated with affection could be transformed into a weapon shook people's trust and sparked fear throughout the country. To understand how Cordelia reached this point, it's necessary to look beyond the crime itself and examine her trajectory, her choices, and the social pressures surrounding her. What led an ordinary woman to cross an irreversible line? This is the story that begins now. Cordelia Botkin married young to Welcome A. Botkin, a man who worked as a civil servant and seemed to represent the stability that society expected for a woman of her position. The marriage took place within the conventional standards of the time, uniting two people who, in the eyes of the community, would form a respectable family. Cordelia sought to establish a stable domestic routine. Welcome worked to support the family, while Cordelia took care of the house and family responsibilities. To outside observers, it was a marriage like so many others of the time, functional, traditional, and aligned with prevailing moral values. Yet behind this appearance of normality, tensions existed that would gradually begin to intensify. Cordelia was not a woman who was easily satisfied with a restricted domestic routine. Records and accounts from the time indicate that she possessed a more expansive and socially active personality than what was considered ideal for wives and mothers. She enjoyed interacting with other people, participating in social gatherings, and occupying prominent positions in the environments she frequented. This characteristic, while not inherently negative, created friction with the expectations of submission and discretion imposed on married women. Over the years, Cordelia and Welcome's marriage began to show clear signs of strain. Differences in temperament became more evident, and marital conflicts began to permeate the family dynamic. Welcome was described as a more reserved and traditional man, while Cordelia demonstrated increasing dissatisfaction with the limitations imposed by her married life. The incompatibility between expectations and personalities created an environment of continuous frustration. At a certain point, the couple decided to separate. In the late 19th century, divorce or even formal separation was extremely difficult and socially stigmatized. Separated women faced severe moral judgment, loss of social status, and considerable economic hardship. Despite this, Cordelia and Welcome chose to go their separate ways, maintaining some level of contact due to their children and practical matters. After the separation, Cordelia made a decision that would profoundly change the course of her life. She moved to San Francisco, California. The move to the West Coast represented not just a geographical change, but a concrete attempt at a fresh start, far from the pressures and judgments associated with the life she had built in Pennsylvania. At the end of the 19th century, San Francisco was a vibrant, cosmopolitan and rapidly growing city, offering opportunities non-existent in smaller communities. San Francisco had undergone a profound transformation since the gold rush of 1849. The city attracted people from all over the world, creating a culturally diverse and socially more flexible environment than other regions of the country. For a woman like Cordelia, seeking greater freedom and social opportunities, San Francisco seemed like the ideal place. The urban environment offered anonymity, a chance for personal reinvention, and greater tolerance for behaviors that would be harshly judged in smaller towns. Cordelia settled in San Francisco and began to build a new life. She rented a house and started living relatively independently, something uncommon for separated women at that time. To support herself, she needed to find ways to generate income, and it is believed that she resorted to different activities to supplement resources she occasionally received from welcome or family members. Life in a large and expensive city required constant adaptation. In San Francisco, Cordelia also began frequenting social circles and forming new relationships. She was considered an attractive woman with good social skills and quickly began participating in events and gatherings. However, her status as a separated woman living alone placed her in an ambiguous social position. While she enjoyed unprecedented freedom, she also faced suspicious glances and judgments about her moral conduct. The 1890s in San Francisco were marked by intense social contrasts. Elegant neighborhoods, inhabited by wealthy families, coexisted with poorer areas that housed workers, immigrants, and people on the fringes of respectable society. There was also an active entertainment scene, with theaters, dance halls, bars, and gambling houses. This scenario offered both opportunities and risks, especially for women who lived without the protection of husbands or family members. It was in this context that Cordelia met John Presley Dunning, an encounter that would definitively change the course of her life. Dunning was a journalist working for the Associated Press in San Francisco. Married and with a family, he nevertheless began a relationship with Cordelia. The involvement between the two would have profound and devastating consequences that neither of them could fully foresee at that time. John Dunning was described as a charismatic and socially active man. His work as a journalist granted him access to diverse social circles and kept him constantly involved in city events. He held a respectable position in San Francisco society, and his marriage to Mary Elizabeth Dunning, known as Bessie, appeared to follow the conventional standards of the time. However, for reasons that historical records do not fully clarify, Dunning began an extramarital affair with Cordelia Botkin. The relationship between Cordelia and John Dunning began gradually, but quickly intensified. For Cordelia, this involvement meant attention, affection, and perhaps the hope of achieving the emotional fulfillment she hadn't found in her previous marriage. She became deeply attached to Dunning, investing herself emotionally in him intensely. For Dunning, the relationship seemed to function as a temporary escape from the pressures and routine of married life, without him having to give up his family or social standing. For a time, the relationship developed without major apparent complications. The two met regularly, and Cordelia came to occupy a significant place in Dunning's life. However, this situation was inherently unstable. Dunning maintained his public image as a respectable married man, while secretly conducting his affair with Cordelia. This duplicity would inevitably generate tensions that were difficult to sustain. Cordelia, for her part, found herself in a particularly vulnerable position. As a separated woman involved in an extramarital affair, she risked her reputation and her already fragile social standing. Furthermore, she was emotionally invested in a man incapable of offering public commitment or any concrete prospect of a future marriage. This reality fueled insecurities and jealousy that intensified over time, causing Cordelia to become increasingly emotionally dependent on Dunning. San Francisco society, while more cosmopolitan than other American cities, still maintained strict moral codes, especially regarding female behavior. Women involved in extramarital affairs were harshly judged, while men in the same situation suffered much milder social consequences. This inequality placed Cordelia at a clear disadvantage, as she risked far more than Dunning by maintaining the relationship. As time went on, the relationship began to show clear signs of strain. Dunning showed no intention of leaving his wife or making his relationship with Cordelia public. He continued to lead a double life, dividing his time and attention between his legitimate family and his mistress. For Cordelia, this situation became increasingly painful and frustrating. She desired something that Dunning was unwilling to offer, and this difference in expectations began to generate constant conflict. Cordelia then began to exhibit behaviors associated with emotional insecurity and intense jealousy. She started questioning Dunning about his activities, demanding more attention, and demonstrating increasingly possessive attitudes. These behaviors, understandable given the fragility of her position, only exacerbated the tensions in the relationship. Dunning, in turn, began to feel pressured and suffocated, a feeling that would lead him to make decisions with tragic consequences. The dynamic between Cordelia and Dunning exemplifies problematic patterns common in extramarital relationships of that period. The power imbalance, unmet expectations, and the impossibility of social recognition created an emotionally unstable environment. For Cordelia, who had already experienced a failed marriage and faced the loneliness of a large city, the relationship with Dunning represented her main source of affection and emotional connection. The loss of this bond would mean profound isolation and further rejection. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain in what would become known as the Spanish-American War. The conflict stemmed from disputes related to Cuban independence and American interests in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Although relatively brief, the war had a significant impact on American society and directly affected the lives of thousands of people, including John Dunning and, by extension, Cordelia Botkin. The journalistic coverage of the conflict was intense. American newspapers fiercely competed for accounts from the front, exploiting sensationalism through dramatic headlines and detailed reports on the fighting. In this scenario, journalists like John Dunning saw the war as a significant professional opportunity. Covering the conflict meant prestige, visibility, and the chance to produce journalistic work considered of great national importance. John Dunning decided to accept an assignment to cover the Spanish-American War as a correspondent. This career choice would have profound implications for everyone involved in his personal life. For his wife, Mary Elizabeth Dunning, known as Bessie, her husband's departure represented worry and uncertainty, but was also understood as part of his professional obligations. For Cordelia Botkin, however, the news of Dunning's departure was deeply devastating. The prospect of seeing Dunning leave for a war zone without knowing when or even if he would return alive deeply affected Cordelia. She was already facing insecurities related to their relationship, and the fact that Dunning maintained a parallel marital life. The physical separation added to these anxieties, creating an emotionally unsustainable situation. Cordelia feared not only for Dunning's safety, but also that the distance would definitively weaken the bond between them. Before leaving to cover the conflict, Dunning made a decision that would have tragic consequences. He decided that his wife Bessie and mother-in-law, Mary Joshua Dean, would leave San Francisco temporarily to settle in Dover, Delaware. The official reasons for this move are not entirely clear in historical records, but it is believed that Dunning wanted to ensure his family was in a calmer and safer environment during his absence, possibly close to relatives or a support network. This decision to send Bessie and her mother-in-law to Delaware also revealed another dimension of the situation. It's possible that Dunning wished to create physical distance between his wife and Cordelia, avoiding encounters or confrontations while he was away. Delaware was located on the other side of the country, thousands of kilometers from San Francisco, ensuring that the two women connected to his life would not have direct contact. This geographical separation, however, would end up producing effects opposite to those intended. For Cordelia, the news that Bessie Dunning and her mother were moving to Delaware stirred complex and intense feelings. On the one hand, the departure of his legitimate wife could be interpreted as an indication that Dunning prioritized his extramarital relationship. On the other hand, the reality was that he was protecting his family before leaving for the war, demonstrating care and marital responsibility. This contradiction amplified the emotional turmoil Cordelia was experiencing. When Dunning finally left to cover the conflict, Cordelia remained alone in San Francisco, facing not only his physical absence, but also uncertainty about the future of their relationship. Letters became the primary means of communication during this period, but correspondence with war zones was irregular and could take weeks to arrive. Cordelia then lived in a constant state of anxiety, awaiting news and trying to maintain some kind of connection despite the distance. The Spanish-American War unfolded primarily in two theaters of operation, Cuba in the Caribbean and the Philippines in the Pacific. In Cuba, notable battles took place, such as the Battle of San Juan Hill, which propelled figures like Theodore Roosevelt onto the national stage. In the Philippines, the American Navy defeated the Spanish fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay. Journalists like Dunning covered these events, sending reports that kept the public informed about the progress of the conflict. During the months that Dunning was away covering the war, Cordelia struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her life in San Francisco. However, the separation exacerbated her insecurities and fueled obsessive thoughts about the relationship. She began to question Dunning's loyalty, fearing that he would forget her or decide to end the long-distance relationship. These fears were not entirely unfounded, considering the unstable and socially delicate nature of the relationship. Meanwhile, in Dover, Delaware, Bessie Dunning and her mother, Mary Joshua Dean, had settled temporarily. Dover was a small, quiet town, very different from the hustle and bustle of San Francisco. The two awaited news of Dunning and hoped for his safe return from the war zone. They were unaware of Dunning's extramarital affair with Cordelia, living under the belief that he was a faithful husband fulfilling his professional responsibilities. The situation formed a complex geographical and emotional triangle. Dunning was in a war zone, Bessie and her mother-in-law were in Delaware, and Cordelia remained in San Francisco. Each of these women maintained a distinct relationship with Dunning and different expectations for the future. However, only Cordelia possessed full knowledge of the real situation, knowing of Bessie's existence while Bessie remained completely unaware of Cordelia's. As time passed, communication between Dunning and Cordelia became less frequent or less satisfactory from her point of view. Whether because Dunning was genuinely absorbed by his journalistic obligations, or because he was beginning to distance himself emotionally from the relationship, Cordelia noticed a change in the tone and regularity of the letters she received. This alteration fueled her worst fears and intensified her emotional distress. Cordelia began to show increasingly evident signs of desperation. She wrote frequent letters to Dunning, expressing her feelings and demanding constant reassurance about the relationship. These correspondences revealed the depth of her emotional attachment and also the fragility of her psychological state. The combination of social isolation, uncertainty about the future, and emotional dependence on an unstable bond created a profoundly dangerous situation from a mental point of view. The war officially ended in August 1898 with an American victory. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December of that year, formalized the end of the conflict and resulted in the transfer of territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to United States control. For the country, the war marked the beginning of a phase of greater international projection and imperial expansion. For those directly involved, including journalists like Dunning, it meant a return to civilian life and personal responsibilities that had been left in limbo. When Dunning returned from the war, Cordelia hoped their relationship would resume with the same intensity as before. However, it quickly became apparent that something had changed. Dunning seemed more distant, less willing to commit in the way Cordelia desired. The experience of the conflict, the time away from San Francisco, and possibly a reassessment of his personal priorities had altered his stance regarding his involvement with Cordelia. Furthermore, Dunning had to deal with the situation of his wife and mother-in-law, who remained in Delaware. He faced decisions about reuniting his family and how to reconcile his marital responsibilities with his extramarital affair. This circumstance added pressure to his relationship with Cordelia, intensifying tensions that would quickly become unsustainable. Cordelia clearly understood that she was losing Dunning. The changes in his behavior, the reduction in attention and affection, and the evasive answers whenever she questioned the future of the relationship indicated a progressive distancing. For a woman who had invested everything emotionally in this bond, risked her reputation, and isolated herself socially, the prospect of losing Dunning was devastating and unacceptable. It was in this context of growing rejection and emotional despair that Cordelia began to develop intense feelings of anger and resentment. These feelings were directed not only at Dunning, but also at Bessie Dunning, the legitimate wife who, in Cordelia's mind, represented the main obstacle to her happiness. Although Cordelia and Bessie had never met in person, Bessie came to occupy a central space in Cordelia's thoughts and emotions. The distance between San Francisco and Delaware, which should have kept the two women separated and unaware of each other, paradoxically became a decisive factor in the crime that was about to occur. Cordelia knew exactly where Bessie Dunning was and knew the address in Dover where she was temporarily residing with her mother. This information, combined with the reliable postal system that connected the entire country, would create the opportunity for an act of violence that would shock the nation. The rejection Cordelia Botkin faced from John Dunning was not just a common romantic disappointment. For her, it represented the loss of everything she had invested emotionally in over the past few years. Her relationship with Dunning had become the center of her existence, the main source of affection and meaning in her life. Watching that bond crumble before her eyes provoked not only profound sadness, but also intense anger and a growing desire for revenge. Cordelia began to blame Bessie Dunning for the deterioration of her relationship with John. In her mind, distorted by rejection and resentment, Bessie was seen as responsible for keeping Dunning trapped in a marriage that prevented him from fully committing to Cordelia. This rationalization completely ignored reality. Bessie was the legitimate wife, unaware of the extramarital affair, and had no responsibility for the situation created by her husband and Cordelia. Cordelia's obsession with Bessie grew stronger each day. She knew Bessie was in Dover, Delaware, temporarily living with her mother while awaiting decisions about the family's future. Cordelia had access to the full address, information she had likely obtained through Dunning or other sources. This knowledge allowed her to imagine Bessie's life, construct mental scenarios about a woman she had never met personally, and nurture fantasies about eliminating what she considered the main obstacle to her happiness. For weeks, Cordelia obsessively ruminated on the situation. Her thoughts revolved incessantly around Dunning, Bessie, and the injustice she believed she was suffering. In her distorted perception, she was the true victim. The woman who sincerely loved Dunning, but was prevented from being with him by social conventions, and the presence of a wife who, according to Cordelia, did not value him as she should. This internal narrative fueled her anger and, in her mind, began to justify increasingly extreme actions. It was in this deeply disturbed mental state that Cordelia began to devise a plan to get rid of Bessie Dunning. She didn't consider confronting the situation directly, seeking emotional support, or simply walking away from a broken relationship. Instead, her mind fixated on the idea that eliminating Bessie would solve all her problems. This logic was clearly flawed, but Cordelia had already crossed the line of rational thought at that point. Obsession had come to completely control her actions. Cordelia's chosen method demonstrated careful premeditation and some knowledge of how to cause harm without arousing immediate suspicion. She decided to resort to poison, specifically arsenic, a relatively accessible substance in the late 19th century. Arsenic was widely used in commercial products of the time, such as pesticides, cleaning agents, and even cosmetics. Obtaining it was not extremely difficult for a determined person, although its use as a poison was well known and investigated when suspicious deaths occurred. Arsenic was especially used by poisoners because it could be administered discreetly, mixed into food or drink. Its initial symptoms were often mistaken for common illnesses, allowing the perpetrator to keep their distance and avoid immediate suspicion. Even so, arsenic possessed characteristics that would eventually reveal its presence, especially when more detailed tests were conducted. Cordelia knew of its lethal effects, but apparently did not fully assess the risks of detection. The main challenge Cordelia faced was how to administer the poison to someone living thousands of miles away, in another state, without any direct personal contact. She couldn't simply travel to Delaware and poison Bessie herself, as that would place her at the crime scene and create obvious connections. Furthermore, Cordelia had never met Bessie in person, making any direct approach impossible. She needed a method that would allow her to deliver the poison remotely, seemingly innocently, and without raising immediate alarm. It was then that Cordelia had the idea that would define the case and shock the nation. She would send the poison through the mail, disguised as a harmless gift. She chose chocolates, sweets that were common and socially accepted gifts, symbols of kindness and affection. A box of chocolates sent through the mail wouldn't arouse any suspicion. People regularly sent gifts through the postal system to distant friends and family. Cordelia's plan exploited this social trust in a sinister way. Cordelia went to a confectionery shop in San Francisco and bought a box of high-quality chocolates. She chose fine chocolates, the kind of gift that would seem appropriate and thoughtfully considered. The macabre irony was that she selected a gift associated with celebration, affection, and happy moments, only to transform it into an instrument of death. After acquiring the chocolates, Cordelia took them home, where she would begin the darkest preparation of her plan. At her home, Cordelia carefully opened the box of chocolates. What followed was an act of premeditated crime, in which the sweets were deliberately adulterated with arsenic, transforming an ordinary gift into an instrument of death. The action was carried out in a calculated manner, with the aim of not arousing immediate suspicion about the origin of the gift. The work was meticulous and revealed the level of premeditation involved. Cordelia wasn't acting on impulse or in a moment of uncontrolled rage. She was executing a carefully thought-out plan, making conscious decisions at every step. While handling the chocolates and inserting the poison, she had countless opportunities to reconsider, to realize the gravity of what she was doing, to choose a different path. Still, she pressed on, determined to eliminate the one she saw as her rival. After preparing the poisoned chocolates, Cordelia needed to send them to Delaware in a way that wouldn't raise suspicion about their origin. She couldn't simply put her own name and address as the sender, as that would create a direct link between her and the crime when the poisoning was discovered. She needed to disguise the package's origin and make it appear as if it came from someone else. Cordelia decided to send the chocolates along with an anonymous note. She didn't sign her name and tried to disguise her handwriting to avoid identification. The note contained a simple message, suggesting that the sweets were a gift from an admirer or friend. The intention was that Mary Elizabeth Dunning and her mother, Bessie Dean, would receive the package, read the note, and consume the chocolates without any suspicion. However, Cordelia made crucial mistakes that would later allow investigators to trace the crime back to her. One of these mistakes was related to how she prepared the shipment. Despite trying to be careful, details in the packaging, the note, and other aspects of the package contained clues that attentive investigators could follow. Furthermore, the unusual and specific method of the crime itself drastically limited the number of possible suspects. With the package prepared, Cordelia went to a post office in San Francisco. It is believed she chose a location where she was not known, to avoid employees later identifying her as the sender of the fatal package. She filled out the necessary information, paid the postage, and handed over the package containing the poisoned chocolates to be sent across the country to Dover, Delaware. By depositing the package in the mail, Cordelia was taking an irreversible step. Once entered into the postal system, she would no longer have control over what would happen. The chocolates would travel through several states, pass through the hands of various employees, and finally arrive at their destination in Delaware. During this journey, Cordelia would still have time to reconsider or even try to prevent the delivery. But she didn't. In the days following the shipment, Cordelia lived in a state of tension and anticipation. She knew approximately how long the package would take to reach Delaware, and anxiously awaited news confirming the success of her plan. She imagined Mary Elizabeth and her mother opening the box, delighted with the gift, consuming the chocolates and becoming gravely ill. In her distorted mind, this would solve her problems and pave the way for her to win Dunning back. What Cordelia failed to adequately consider were the broader consequences of her actions. She did not reflect on the suffering she would cause, not only to the direct victims but to everyone around them. She did not consider that Bessie Dean, Mary Elizabeth's mother, could also consume the chocolates and become a victim. Nor did she imagine how John Dunning would react to the tragedy or how the subsequent investigation would ultimately reveal everything, destroying any possibility of a future she might still have had. The American postal system, which Cordelia had exploited as an instrument of her crime, was considered extremely reliable and secure. People trusted the mail service to transport not only mail, but also valuables, gifts, and important documents. The idea that someone would use this system to send something lethal was practically unthinkable. Cordelia Botkin's case would change that perception and raise questions about postal security and the need for stricter regulations to protect the public. While the package slowly traveled across the country toward Delaware, Cordelia tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy in San Francisco. She continued her routine activities, interacted with neighbors and acquaintances, and did not outwardly display the dark thoughts that occupied her mind. This ability to conceal revealed a disturbing aspect of her personality, the ability to plan and execute a horrific crime while maintaining a facade of normalcy in everyday life. The package containing the poisoned chocolates traveled across the United States following established postal routes between the West Coast and the East Coast. The American postal system of the late 19th century was surprisingly efficient, utilizing trains, carriages, and local distribution to ensure that mail and parcels reached their destinations in a reasonable time. Cordelia Botkin's package followed this route, passing through multiple cities and states until finally arriving in Dover, Delaware. Dover, in 1898, was a small, quiet town, very different from the hustle and bustle of San Francisco. As the capital of the state of Delaware, Dover had administrative importance, but it retained the characteristics of a small-town community where everyone knew each other and life followed a calmer pace. It was in this peaceful environment that Mary Elizabeth Dunning and her mother, Bessie Dean, were temporarily residing, awaiting news about John Dunning's return from the war and the family's next steps. Mary Elizabeth Dunning was the legal wife of John Presley Dunning. She had married him years before, and as far as is known, maintained a marriage that, to outsiders, seemed stable and conventional. Mary was unaware of her husband's extramarital affair with Cordelia Botkin in San Francisco. She lived under the belief that John was a faithful husband who fulfilled his professional responsibilities as a journalist. Mary was described by acquaintances as a kind, polite woman devoted to her family. Bessie Dean was Mary Elizabeth Dunning's mother. The two maintained a close and supportive relationship. Bessie had accompanied her daughter during her stay in Dover, offering companionship and emotional support during John Dunning's absence. Her mother's presence was comforting to Mary, and they both shared domestic responsibilities and a simple routine in the small community of Dover. They both anxiously awaited news of John and planned for their eventual return to normal life when he finally came back from the war. Mary and Bessie's routine in Dover was simple and predictable. They took care of the house, kept in touch with neighbors, participated in modest community social activities, and awaited mail that kept them informed about events in other parts of the country. The arrival of letters and packages was always a welcome event, bringing news from family, friends, or occasionally, unexpected gifts that broke the monotony of daily life. It was probably at the end of August 1898 that the package sent by Cordelia Botkin arrived at the address where Mary and Bessie were residing in Dover. The package presented nothing suspicious in its external appearance. It was an ordinary parcel, the kind that thousands of people received daily through the American mail. The weight and size suggested that it contained some kind of gift, and there was nothing that could alert the recipients to the deadly danger hidden inside the seemingly innocent package. When Mary or Bessie opened the package and discovered the box of fine chocolates, Their initial reaction was certainly one of pleasant surprise. Chocolates were appreciated gifts, and receiving a box in the mail suggested that someone had thought of them fondly. The note accompanying the chocolates, though not clearly signed, likely contained kind words or suggestions that the gift came from a well-meaning admirer or friend. There was nothing in the presentation that could arouse suspicion. Cordelia Botkin's specific target was Mary Elizabeth Dunning, John's legitimate wife. In Cordelia's distorted mind, Mary represented the main obstacle to her happiness. It was Mary who maintained the marital bond with John, preventing him from fully committing to Cordelia. The address on the package was for the residence where Mary was staying, and the chocolates were sent with the intention that she would consume them. What exactly happened in the moments that followed is not fully documented in historical records, but later evidence has allowed researchers to reconstruct the events with reasonable certainty. Mary and Bessie, with no reason to suspect the gift, decided to try the chocolates. They likely offered the sweets to each other, sharing what they believed to be a kind gift sent by someone who cared about them. They had no way of knowing that each chocolate contained enough arsenic to cause severe poisoning or death. The first symptoms of arsenic poisoning can appear between 30 minutes and several hours after ingestion, depending on the dose consumed and individual factors. Initial symptoms often include intense abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and severe diarrhea. These symptoms can easily be confused with common food poisoning or gastrointestinal illnesses, which often delays correct diagnosis and appropriate treatment. For Mary and Bessie, the symptoms began to appear a few hours after consuming the chocolates. Initially, when Mary and Bessie began to feel unwell, they probably didn't associate their discomfort with the chocolates they had eaten. It was common for people to occasionally get sick for various reasons, and the first reaction would be to attribute the symptoms to spoiled food, a change in the weather, or some temporary illness. However, as the symptoms intensified and both women began to show signs of severe poisoning, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. The progression of arsenic poisoning is particularly cruel. After the initial gastrointestinal symptoms, victims may experience severe dehydration, a sharp drop in blood pressure, seizures, and eventually multiple organ failure. The suffering is intense and prolonged. For Mary and Bessie, who had no idea what was causing this sudden and violent illness, terror and confusion certainly added to the physical suffering. Neighbors or people nearby, realizing the seriousness of the situation, called for medical assistance. The doctors who attended to Mary and Bessie faced a clinical mystery. Both presented similar symptoms of severe poisoning, but the cause was not immediately evident. The doctors resorted to the treatments available at the time, trying to stabilize the patients, control the symptoms, and reduce the effects of whatever was causing the poisoning. However, without knowing exactly what substance was involved, medical resources were extremely limited. Bessie Dean was particularly affected by the poisoning. It is believed that she consumed a larger quantity of chocolates, or that her body, more fragile due to age, reacted more severely to the arsenic. Despite medical efforts, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The combination of intense dehydration, damage to internal organs, and the overall impact of the poison on her system proved devastating. Bessie died a few days after consuming the poisoned chocolates, becoming the fatal victim of Cordelia Botkin's macabre plan. The death of Bessie Dean, under such sudden and mysterious circumstances, raised immediate suspicions. Doctors and local authorities began investigating the circumstances of her death. The fact that Mary Elizabeth Dunning was also seriously ill, exhibiting virtually identical symptoms, strongly suggested that both had been exposed to the same toxic substance. The central question then became identifying the source of the poisoning. Mary Elizabeth Dunning was fighting for her life, facing the same terrible symptoms that had killed her mother. Her condition was critical, and it was unclear whether she would survive. Doctors intensified their care, but without specific knowledge of the causative agent, treatment options remained limited. Mary was conscious enough to understand that her mother had died and that she herself was in serious danger. The emotional trauma of the loss added to the physical suffering of the poisoning. In the days following Bessie's death, investigators in Dover examined everything the two had eaten or drunk recently. They spoke to neighbors, checked the food in the house, and tried to identify any possible source of contamination. It was during this process that someone mentioned the package of chocolates received in the mail a few days earlier. The chocolates were the only new and unusual item that both had ingested before falling ill. The remaining chocolates were immediately collected and sent for analysis. Chemists and toxicologists of the time already had methods for detecting arsenic in food and other substances. The Marsh test, developed in 1836, was a reliable procedure for identifying the presence of the poison, even in small quantities. When the chocolates were analyzed, the results confirmed the worst suspicions. They contained lethal levels of arsenic. The confirmation that the chocolates were poisoned transformed the case from a medical mystery into a criminal homicide investigation. It became clear that someone had deliberately sent poisoned chocolates through the mail with the intention to kill. From that moment on, the authorities' priority became identifying who had committed the crime and what the motive had been. Investigators then began to carefully examine the package, searching for clues about its origin. The news spread quickly. The death of one woman and the severe poisoning of another through chocolates sent through the mail was a shocking case that immediately attracted media attention. Local newspapers in Delaware began covering the event, and soon the story began circulating in publications in other states. The unusual method of the crime and the use of the postal system aroused fear and fascination in public opinion. Mary Elizabeth Dunning, after days of battling the effects of arsenic, slowly began to show signs of improvement. Whether because she had eaten less chocolate, because her body reacted differently, or because she received timely medical care, Mary survived the poisoning. Even so, she would be forever scarred by the experience, both physically and emotionally. She had lost her mother in a brutal way and come dangerously close to death. When John Dunning received news of what had happened to his wife and mother-in-law, his reaction was one of shock and horror. He immediately traveled to Dover to be by Mary's side during her recovery. Tragedy had struck his family in a brutal and incomprehensible way. Dunning faced not only grief over the death of his mother-in-law, Bessie Dean, but also disturbing questions about who could have committed such a terrible act and why. Initially, Dunning may not have connected the crime to Cordelia Botkin. The idea that someone he knew personally could be capable of such an act was difficult to process. However, as the investigation progressed and details about the package began to emerge, connections inevitably began to point towards San Francisco and the secret relationship Dunning had maintained with Cordelia. The California postmark proved to be a crucial clue that would guide the entire investigation. The investigation into the origin of the poisoned chocolates was only beginning. Authorities in Delaware began working to trace the package back to its point of origin, a complex task that required cooperation between different jurisdictions, meticulous analysis of physical evidence, and thorough investigative work. What would be discovered would ultimately shock public opinion even further and reveal a story of obsession, jealousy, and revenge worthy of the darkest narratives of the time. The investigation gained urgency after confirmation that arsenic had been deliberately inserted into the chocolates. The case now clearly constituted premeditated murder, and Delaware authorities mobilized efforts to identify the perpetrator. The unusual nature of the crime, using the postal system to transport poison over long distances, presented unprecedented investigative challenges that required interstate cooperation and innovative methods for the time. The researchers began by meticulously examining the package that had contained the deadly chocolates. The packaging, the paper used, the address, the handwriting, the postage stamps, and any other visible detail were carefully analyzed. The postmark indicated that the shipment had been made from San Francisco, California, crucial information that immediately directed the investigation to the West Coast. The distance between sender and victims reinforced the idea that this was not an impulsive crime, but a carefully planned scheme. The note that came with the chocolates also received special attention. Although it was unsigned and the writing appeared disguised, handwriting analysis experts were consulted to identify possible characteristics of the author. The text, the choice of words, the writing style, and even the type of paper used were considered relevant clues. Each element was recorded and studied, helping to gradually form a profile of the person responsible for the crime. Meanwhile, John Dunning remained in Dover by his wife, Mary Elizabeth's side, who was slowly recovering from the effects of the poisoning. His presence was a source of support for Mary, but it also placed him in a deeply uncomfortable position. He knew something the investigators were still unaware of. He had had an extramarital affair in San Francisco, and the origin of the package pointed directly to the city where this involvement had occurred. The possibility that Cordelia Botkin was linked to the crime began to form in his mind with growing anguish. Dunning faced an intense moral dilemma. Revealing his relationship with Cordelia would mean publicly exposing his infidelity, compromising his reputation, causing his wife even more suffering, and admitting that his personal choices may have contributed to Bessie Dean's death and nearly to Mary's. On the other hand, concealing this information could jeopardize the investigation and allow the perpetrator to go unpunished. The emotional and ethical weight of this decision was overwhelming. As the investigation progressed, detectives began asking Dunning increasingly specific questions about his connections in San Francisco. They wanted to know if he knew anyone in the city who might have a motive to attack his family. Initially, Dunning tried to avoid revealing incriminating details, offering vague or incomplete answers. However, the investigators were persistent and experienced, and soon realized he was withholding relevant information. Pressure mounted when evidence emerged, from testimonies and other sources, that Dunning had maintained personal relationships in addition to his professional activities in San Francisco. Faced with the converging evidence and the impossibility of remaining silent without compromising the investigation, Dunning eventually admitted his relationship with Cordelia Botkin. The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. For Mary, still recovering physically and emotionally from the poisoning and the grief over her mother's death, discovering her husband's infidelity added another betrayal that was difficult to bear. For investigators, the information provided the clear motive that was missing: jealousy and revenge on the part of a rejected lover. For the public, as details began to leak to the press, the case took on dimensions of moral scandal beyond criminal horror. With Cordelia Botkin identified as the prime suspect, authorities in Delaware contacted their counterparts in California, requesting that she be located and questioned. Detectives in San Francisco quickly found Cordelia's address and went to her residence. When confronted by investigators, Cordelia initially denied any involvement in the crime. She claimed to know nothing about poisoned chocolates and suggested it was all a misunderstanding or confusion. However, investigators possessed substantial evidence pointing to her. Analysis of the note that accompanied the chocolates, when compared with handwriting samples of Cordelia obtained later, revealed significant similarities despite attempts at disguise. Furthermore, it was discovered that Cordelia had purchased chocolates at a specific San Francisco bakery a few days before sending the fatal package. The store owner was able to identify her as a customer, providing yet another direct connection. Perhaps even more damaging, investigators gathered evidence that Cordelia had had access to arsenic substances. At the time, arsenic was present in common products, and its circulation was not as strictly controlled as it would be in later decades. Still, testimonies and commercial records could, in certain cases, indicate suspicious purchases or requests. As this information accumulated, Cordelia's position became progressively more precarious. Cordelia's residence was thoroughly searched. Investigators were looking for any physical evidence that could definitively link her to the crime. Packaging materials similar to those used in the package sent to Delaware, notes, correspondence with Dunning, that confirmed the relationship and indicated a possible motive, or any other relevant item. The search yielded elements that further strengthened the case against her. Letters exchanged between Cordelia and John Dunning proved particularly significant. These correspondences made evident the nature of their extramarital affair and the progressive deterioration of their bond over time. More recent letters written by Cordelia demonstrated growing despair, resentment, and emotional tension following her rejection. Although there was no explicit confession of the plan, the tone of the messages supported the narrative of an intense emotional motive. Witnesses in San Francisco were also interviewed. Some reported that Cordelia appeared more agitated in the weeks leading up to the package being sent. Others mentioned recurring comments about Dunning and signs of emotional instability, after the end of the relationship. These testimonies helped to paint, in the eyes of the investigation, a picture of someone capable of planning an extreme act driven by resentment and frustration. The toxicological analysis of the remaining chocolates was conclusive. Chemists determined not only the presence of arsenic, but also that the poison had been intentionally inserted into several chocolates in the box. This was not accidental contamination or a single affected candy. Someone had systematically adulterated the chocolates, drastically increasing the likelihood of ingesting a lethal dose. This pattern reinforced the homicidal intent and premeditation. Faced with the body of evidence, Cordelia continued to deny guilt, but her explanations became increasingly unconvincing. She claimed improbable coincidences, investigative errors, and the possibility of being framed. However, the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence pointing in her direction severely weakened these claims. Authorities concluded there was sufficient evidence to formally charge Cordelia Botkin with the murder of Bessie Dean and the attempted murder of Mary Elizabeth Dunning. Cordelia was arrested in San Francisco and informed that she would face trial in California, where the sending and tampering of the gift occurred. News of the arrest spread rapidly, and newspapers across the country began publishing detailed accounts describing Cordelia as the chocolate box killer, a nickname that would forever be associated with the case. The public reaction was intense and multifaceted. There was horror at the cruelty and coldness of the crime. The idea that a seemingly kind gift could be transformed into an instrument of death deeply violated social expectations and generated fear. Many people became suspicious of packages received through the mail, especially food, demonstrating how the episode shook collective confidence in a system considered secure. At the same time, a morbid fascination with details emerged. Newspapers competed for information, interviewed people connected to the case, and speculated about the emotional aspects that might have led to the poisoning. The triangle involving Cordelia, Dunning, and Dover's family fueled headlines, combining crime, betrayal, and revenge in a way that was irresistible to the public of the time. The case also sparked debates about morality and the place of women in society. In an era that idealized women as naturally docile and morally superior, the accusation that a woman had planned a murder by poisoning caused shock and discomfort. For some, Cordelia was a frightening deviation. For others, it was proof that women could also commit extreme violence when driven by resentment and obsession. John Dunning became the target of public scrutiny. Although he was not criminally charged, many considered him morally responsible for creating the situation that culminated in the tragedy. His infidelity was exposed, and the idea that his personal choices had contributed to the death of one woman and the suffering of another eroded his professional and personal reputation. Moral judgment, amplified by the press, began to follow him. For Mary Elizabeth Dunning, the pain was indescribable. She had survived the poisoning but had lost her mother in a cruel way, and in the midst of her recovery, was forced to confront her husband's betrayal and public scandal. Mary had to cope with grief, humiliation, physical trauma, and the fear of having been deliberately targeted by someone she had never met personally. Rebuilding her life in any sense would be slow and difficult. Meanwhile, preparations began for Cordelia Botkin's trial in California. With the arrest made and the evidence gathered, the prosecution began organizing the case, and the defense sought strategies to contest an accusation supported by multiple circumstantial evidence and testimonies. The country followed each step as if it were a spectacle, but for the victims and their families, it was a real tragedy, marked by irreversible consequences. The opening of the trial would mark the next phase, a public confrontation between versions, evidence, and reputations in which every detail, from the note to the postmark, could decide Cordelia Botkin's fate. And for a nation fascinated by crime and scandal, the court would become the final stage where obsession, revenge, and justice would be pitted against each other. The trial of Cordelia Botkin began in San Francisco, California, amidst an atmosphere of intense public anticipation. The case had captured the imagination of the entire country, and journalists from various publications traveled to the West Coast to cover every detail of the proceedings. The The courtroom was packed from day one, with people queuing hours beforehand to secure a seat and personally witness the unfolding of what was already being called one of the most sensational criminal cases of the century. Cordelia Botkin entered the courtroom to face formal charges of first-degree murder for the death of Bessie Dean and the attempted murder of Mary Elizabeth Dunning. The prosecution argued that the crime had been carefully planned and executed with full awareness of the consequences, demonstrating clear premeditation that justified the more serious charges. Cordelia's defense faced a monumental challenge. The evidence against her was substantial and compelling. The prosecution meticulously built its case, presenting piece of evidence connecting Cordelia to the crime. Chemists testified about the presence of arsenic in the chocolates and explained how the poison had been deliberately inserted into multiple candies. The owner of the San Francisco bakery identified Cordelia as the person who had purchased the chocolates days before the fatal shipment. Postal records showed that the package had been sent from San Francisco during the period Cordelia was in the city. Handwriting experts compared the note that accompanied the chocolates with samples of Cordelia's writing. Although she had tried to disguise her handwriting, the experts identified consistent characteristics that strongly suggested she had written the note. The analysis was not perfectly conclusive by modern standards, but by the standards of the time it was considered significant and reliable evidence. Perhaps the most dramatic and emotionally impactful testimony came from John Dunning. He was called to testify by the prosecution and had to publicly admit under oath the details of his extramarital affair with Cordelia. Dunning described how he met Cordelia in San Francisco, how the relationship developed, and how he eventually tried to end the affair. He recounted the intensity of Cordelia's reactions, her discomfort with rejection, and how the end of the affair came to involve tension, suspicion, and fear. Dunning's testimony was essential in establishing the motive for the crime. The prosecution argued that Cordelia, consumed by jealousy and anger after being rejected by Dunning, had decided to strike Mary Elizabeth Dunning as a form of revenge, the wife who, in Cordelia's mind, represented the ultimate obstacle. The logic was clearly flawed and demonstrated distorted thinking, but the prosecution argued that crimes of passion often involve irrationality, and that this does not diminish the criminal responsibility of someone who executes a premeditated plan. Mary Elizabeth Dunning, a survivor of the poisoning, was also presented as a central figure in the case, still physically and emotionally scarred by what happened. Her account helped reconstruct the arrival of the package in Dover, the consumption of the chocolates, and the rapid onset of symptoms, as well as the shock of seeing her mother become ill and die. The human impact of the narrative reinforced the gravity of the crime and gave weight to the direct consequences of the box sent through the mail. Cordelia's defense attempted several strategies to create reasonable doubt. Her lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no absolute proof that Cordelia had personally prepared and sent the poisoned chocolates. They suggested that other people might have had access to the chocolates, that perhaps someone was trying to frame Cordelia, or that the forensic analyses might be flawed. However, each of these arguments faced significant contradictions when confronted with the volume of evidence presented by the prosecution. The defense also attempted to argue that Cordelia was emotionally disturbed and that her actions may have resulted from temporary mental instability caused by rejection and emotional distress. At the time, case law regarding temporary insanity and diminished criminal responsibility was still developing, and this type of defense faced considerable skepticism. Prosecutors countered that the premeditation demonstrated by the planning and use of the mail proved that Cordelia was aware of her actions and their consequences. Cordelia Botkin had the opportunity to testify in her own defense, but it was a risky decision that her lawyers likely debated extensively. During her testimony, Cordelia denied sending the poisoned chocolates. She admitted to the relationship with Dunning, but described the situation in a way that portrayed her as a victim of broken promises and unfair treatment. She attempted to elicit sympathy by describing her struggles as a separated woman, trying to survive alone in a large city. However, during cross-examination, the prosecutors were relentless. They exposed inconsistencies in her statements, confronted her with evidence that contradicted her claims, and systematically undermined her credibility. Cordelia became visibly agitated during the cross-examination, showing flashes of the anger and emotional intensity that had been described by witnesses. This behavior in court likely harmed her defense more than it helped. After weeks of testimony, presentation of evidence, and legal arguments, the time for closing statements arrived. The prosecution powerfully summarized the case, arguing that Cordelia Botkin had committed a cold and calculated murder, using the postal system as a weapon and exploiting the public's reliance on gifts sent through the mail. They asked the jury to consider not only the death of Bessie Dean, but also the suffering of Mary Elizabeth Dunning and the danger Cordelia posed to society. The defense made its final best effort, arguing that doubts remained, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that sentencing a woman to the maximum penalty based on such evidence would be unjust. They appealed to the jury's compassion, asking them to consider the emotional and personal circumstances that had led Cordelia to that point. However, the defense attorneys likely knew they faced an uphill battle given the weight of the evidence against their client. The jury retired to deliberate on the verdict. The deliberation process took several hours, during which speculation ran rampant among trial observers and journalists gathered outside the courtroom. When the jury finally returned, the tension in the air was palpable. Cordelia Botkin stood to hear the decision, her face reflecting the extreme pressure of that crucial moment. The verdict was guilty. The jury concluded that Cordelia Botkin was responsible for the murder of Bessie Dean, Mary Joshua Dean, mother of Mary Elizabeth Dunning. The evidence presented throughout the trial was deemed strong enough to overcome any reasonable doubt. When the verdict was announced, audible reactions echoed in the courtroom. Cordelia showed little outward emotion, remaining relatively composed in the face of the gravity of the conviction. The sentencing phase occurred immediately after the verdict. In first-degree murder cases at that time, the death penalty was a real possibility in several jurisdictions. However, there was intense debate about applying capital punishment to women, and several factors influenced the final decision. The judge considered the premeditation of the crime, the suffering inflicted on the victims, and the risk Cordelia posed. At the same time, her gender, age, and personal circumstances were also taken into account. The final sentence was life imprisonment. Cordelia Botkin was sentenced to remain incarcerated indefinitely in the California prison system. For a woman of that time, this meant that the possibility of freedom became practically non-existent. The decision was met with approval by many who followed the case, although some argued that the death penalty would have been more fitting for the gravity of the crime committed. Cordelia was transferred to a penitentiary to serve her sentence. The following years of her life would be spent in confinement, isolated from society and marked by the national notoriety of the case. The woman who had sought love, recognition, and belonging through a forbidden relationship now faced the reality of having destroyed lives, including her own, through a carefully calculated act of revenge. The impact of the Cordelia Botkin case extended far beyond the courtroom. The crime raised serious questions about the security of the American postal system. Authorities acknowledged that the mail had been dangerously exploited and began discussing stricter measures for inspecting and controlling packages and parcels. Although structural changes would take time, the case contributed to a national debate about protecting the public against crimes committed remotely. The episode went down in American criminal history as one of the first widely documented cases of murder committed using poisoned food sent through the mail. Criminologists and historians would study the case for decades as an example of premeditated crime, violence motivated by jealousy and obsession, and the investigative challenges posed by crimes committed across distant states. The nickname "chocolate box killer" would remain associated with Cordelia Botkin in the collective memory. For Mary Elizabeth Dunning, life after the trial was marked by profound losses. She survived the poisoning, but lost her mother in a brutal way, and during her recovery was forced to publicly confront her husband's betrayal and the ensuing scandal. Even without detailed records of the years that followed, it is difficult to imagine that her life could have continued without scars after a tragedy of such magnitude. Mary would carry physical and emotional scars from that episode for a long time. John Dunning, for his part, faced lasting social consequences. Although he was not held criminally responsible, his reputation was deeply damaged. His infidelity became public, and his relationship with Cordelia became an inseparable part of the crime narrative. He would have to live with the weight of knowing that personal choices were linked to a tragedy that devastated his own family. Cordelia Botkin remained imprisoned for years after her conviction. Life in the prison system was especially harsh for women convicted of violent crimes, who were still relatively rare in prisons at the time. Cordelia faced not only physical confinement, but also social isolation, loss of identity, and the certainty that she would never be seen as an ordinary person again. After the 1906 earthquake, she was transferred to San Quentin prison, where she remained until her death in 1910, ending a life that began conventionally and ended in infamy and seclusion. More than a century later, the case of Cordelia Botkin continues to be remembered